As I have already mentioned, the critical Achilles heel of international human rights law is its limited enforcement capacity. Many states have went out of their way to dilute the enforcement power of international human rights monitoring bodies or to take over those bodies. Moreover, even when the system works as planned from an international human rights law perspective, it is quite unlikely that states would actually comply with international human rights law when important state or group interests, such as suppressing a rebellion or endangering the grasp of a political party on government, are perceived to run in the contrary direction. More generally, the principle of state sovereignty, which we've discussed before, limits the ability of a horizontal system of enforcement, such as the one applied by international human rights treaties, to meaningfully challenge the calculus when the stakes are high enough. So the ability of international law to deter states from violating human rights law remains limited. At times, violating states may even pay compensation to victims and continue to violate international human rights law. International criminal law, as applied to international human rights law related topics, was introduced in international law in order to change this calculus and to raise the stakes for leaders involved in the planning or execution of mass atrocity crimes. The key principle in this regard was established by the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, where it was held that there is a policy argument that would support the reading in of personal responsibility into international law text. That argument being that, and I quote, "crimes against international law are committed by men, not abstract entities, and only by punishing individuals who commit such crimes can the provisions of international law be enforced." As we shall see, this logic has never been applied to all rules of international law, but to a select number of rules, primarily related to mass atrocity crimes, where shared community interests and ineffective state response justified a move to international criminalization. At the heart of the introduction of personal responsibility is the notion that personal deterrence could be more effective than state deterrence, given the amenability of individuals to pressures which states are not necessarily amenable to, such as imprisonment and even in the Nuremberg case, capital punishment. So moving from state to state relations and even international community to state or relations to state versus individuals or international community versus individual relationship changes the balance of power and creates new deterrence leverages. It is also implicitly presumed, perhaps cynically, on the proposition that the introduction of personal responsibility changes the calculus in some cases for the individual, in the sense that it introduces another set of interests into the decision-making process, and that leaders are expected often to change state policy for fear of their own skin, if for nothing else. It appears, however, that deterrence can only work well if prospects for apprehensions are reasonably real and where the competing pressures to violate the law are relatively weaker than those generated by international criminal law. So if a militant group has to weigh the choice between fighting in the open and being smashed to pieces by its adversary, to fighting a guerrilla war from among the civilian population, which is a more effective strategy but may constitute a war crime of using human shields, it is hard to see how international criminal law can radically change the decision-making dynamic. At most, it can legitimize the neutralization by legal means of dangerous people after they have been apprehended or encourage third parties to apprehend them. Another advantage of the move to personal responsibility is guilt individualization. There is something morally troubling about requiring victims and non-willing citizens to incur the burdens of state remedies. In all events, the enforcement of international human rights law through international criminal law builds on the experience of the international community in fighting pirates. The latter were viewed as hostis humani generis, namely enemies of mankind in its entirety. As a result, classic international law doctrine has accepted that all states have universal jurisdiction over piracy crimes and may detain and try pirates they encounter on the high seas. The role of states under this doctrine is that of global law enforcement. The leap that has been made after World War II, first in Nuremberg and in Tokyo, and then in the Eichmann and Pinochet case, has been to equate war criminals and other perpetrators of mass atrocity crimes to pirates, in the sense that, like pirates, their continued impunity threatened the common interest in universal peace, security, and justice. The argument being less that the same perpetrators will continue to violate human rights if they go unpunished, and more that their impunity may encourage others to simulate them and go down the same path. Second, like pirates and slave traders in the 19th century, perpetrators of war crimes and mass atrocity crimes often operate outside the effective jurisdiction of their state of nationality, which is often unwilling or unable to stop such crimes. The development of international criminal law can therefore be seen as deriving from the growing acceptance of humanitarian interests at the international level. It represents a commitment to give such interests a real bite. In the normal run of things, states are expected to self-enforce these obligations. But with respect to the most extreme of these violations, when one is dealing with widespread or systematic serious attacks on civilians, crimes against humanity or other mass atrocity crimes, or with respect to torture, which is a jus cogens norm, a fundamental norm of international law, or when international human rights violations are perpetrated in the context of an armed conflict, when the incentives to initiate criminal proceedings against one's own soldiers are rather limited, a move to internationalization of criminal enforcement has been accepted as a necessary mean. With regard to such aggravated human rights violations, international law now operates on a two-track level of approach. There are individual criminal responsibility remedies that complement the traditional state-centric type of remedies which ordinary international human rights law mechanisms impose on states.